Hello, welcome back to Melissa Reed's Avatar. It's a beautiful day today, so I've decided to lay out in my lounge chair on my deck and read chapter 10. Thought I'd better take the chance, because the weather plays true to form. It'll probably start raining tomorrow and rain for a week, so let's get started on chapter 10. Whirling plumes of light spun up from wavering planes of fire, the radiant shapes lengthening thousands of meters until they grew too vast to sustain themselves. The funnels collapsed, disintegrating back into the amorphic ocean of red and orange before rising anew, the dance of the storms beautiful, threatening, and eternal. After watching for what seemed like hours, Commander Elias Vaughn finally broke the silence. "Are we done yet?" Captain Picard? What? Captain Picard smiled, not looking away from the incredible light show. "Done watching?" "Done looking for the brain." "They're not here, Jean-Luc. I don't think they ever were." Picard's smile faded. "I've come to agree with you, but we have to be thorough. Another run through the thick of it, and we'll have completed a second grid. We want to be able to declare a reasonable certainty after all our efforts." Let's move this. They stood before the viewport in the captain's ready room, the ever-shifting view of the Badlands spread out in front of them, in shades of flame. For the last several days, the two men had taken to meeting there as the ship completed each run to watch the plasma storms together. It's a little hard to read with my sunglasses on. The Enterprise had been searching the treacherous area for nearly 3 weeks, the constant atmospheric disturbances making it necessary to pilot and investigate manually, their sensors useless beyond a very short range. One of the dogs is in my lap, behind the computer, that's why it keeps moving. Vaughn had come aboard to advise the mission on Bring tactics, though even if their supposed presence had turned out to be true, he doubted he'd have been in much use. The captain and the crew of the Enterprise E were more than worthy of their distinction, and Vaughn was certain they could handle themselves against a few Breen. It's been nice to spend some time with Picard and his people anyway. Vaughn liked Picard, having met him on more than one occasion in the past. He'd always thought the captain bright, if a bit dry, and surprisingly well-rounded. Sorry, I can't seem to find a good spot to hold it. There's glare. His tactical instincts were superb, and he carried his command well, with distinction and grace. A little formal, perhaps, but not offensively so, his politeness clearly stemming from a respect for others, rather than some self-promoting mechanism. But Vaughn had worked with this particular Enterprise crew only once before, at the Betazed Emancipation over a year ago, a mission that had earned them his profound respect. The intercom beeped, Will Riker's voice interrupting his musings. "Captain, the new course is plotted. Allowing for the predicted plasma currents, Commander Data suggests that we begin immediately, and then we start out at 1/4 impulse for the first 2 million kilometers. "Make it so," Picard said, and as the ship eased toward the shimmering Badlands, Vaughn thought again about the coded transmission he'd received only a few hours before. Even the dramatic beauty of the plasma storms wasn't enough to distract him entirely. He was bone-tired, and not from 3 weeks of chasing a rumor. "I'm thinking of retiring, Jean-Luc," Vaughn said abruptly, a little surprised at his own impulsiveness as the words left his mouth. He'd been considering it for months, but hadn't planned to tell anyone until he'd decided. And he didn't even know Picard all that well, although he probably knows me as well as anyone. Vaughn didn't know if that was good or bad, but it was the truth. Picard also seemed surprised. He turned to look at Vaughn, eyebrows arched. Really? May I ask why? You may, but I'm not sure I have an answer, Vaughn said. I suppose I could just say that I'm getting too old. Nonsense. You can't be much older than I am. Vaughn smiled. He'd never looked his age. I'm 101, actually. Picard smiled back at him. You wear it well, but you still have decades ahead of you, Elias. I suppose I mean old in spirit, Vaughn said, sighing. Since the end of the war, I find myself thinking differently about things. After 80 years of charging off to battle. He paused, thinking. He'd never been an eloquent man, but he wanted very much to define the path of his feelings, as much for himself as for Picard. After so long a war, so little time for pleasures or luxuries, he felt out of touch with the delicacy of his self-perceptions. I've always been a soldier, he said. I was trained for it and have excelled at it. And for a long time I felt my role to be an integral part of the peace process. Now, though, just lately I've been thinking of the universe as an unending series of conflicts that doesn't need another aging warrior to help circumscribe them. Vaughn shook his head, searching for more words to explain what he'd been feeling. Wars will always be waged, I know that. But I'm starting to think of myself as a participant in war, rather than someone working toward peace. And the difference between the two is immeasurable. Picard was silent for a moment, and they watched as the Enterprise slid effortlessly into the bright and turbulent space of the Badlands. Vaughn felt strangely relaxed, at ease with the captain's silence. He suspected that what he'd said was being carefully measured by Picard, scrupulously considered, and the thought was oddly comforting. Perhaps you need a change of vocation, Picard said finally. Do you know the story of Marcus Aurelius? Vaughn smiled. A great warrior of ancient Rome, a general who'd lost his taste for battle in spite of his successes. The original soldier-philosopher of Earth. You flatter me. Not at all, and I'm not suggesting that you turn to writing your meditations on war and peace, though perhaps that's not such a terrible idea. You have more strategic and tactical experience than any career officer I've ever known, Elias. That doesn't mean you have to use it as a soldier would. You could write or teach. Picard faced him, his expression earnest. Of course, you can do whatever you wish. But forgive my presumption, I don't think you're the kind of man who would be content to sit back and watch the world go by. Vaughn nodded slowly. You may be right about that. He took a deep breath and expelled it heavily, finally reaching the foundation of his thought, the essence of what he was trying to express. I don't know. I just know that I don't want to fight anymore. Picard leaned back, looked out at the fiery storm once more. I understand, he said softly, and Vaughn believed that he truly did. The captain's ability to empathize was perhaps his most admirable trait. It was a rarity in any species, and most particularly in upper echelon Starfleet. The intercom signaled again. Captain, Commander, we may have something. That was a surprise. Vaughn left his personal thoughts behind as he followed Picard toward the door to the bridge. He'd been so sure that the Breen had already decided that perhaps the Klingons had picked up... He'd been so sure about the Breen, had already decided that perhaps the Klingons had picked up something, but that possible Breen warp signatures wasn't it. Following the treaty, the Breen had withdrawn to their home space for the most part. But though they were certainly capable of deceit, building a military presence in hiding didn't fit with the Breen's cultural psychology. Although it does fit in with a few other reports I've heard of late. Reports that were still on a need-to-know basis. It was a funny thought, though Vaughn was too aware of the Enterprise's current position to find any humor in it. Hey, Sammy. Want to hear me read too? They stepped out onto the bridge and moved to their seats, Vaughn taking the advisory position to the captain's left. All they could see on screen was the rolling sea of unstable plasma. Mr. Data, report, Picard said. The android consulted his operations console as he spoke. Sir, the ship I am detecting is not Breen. It is a freighter, and it appears to be Cardassian in origin. Picard frowned. From his other side, Riker spoke softly. What's a freighter doing out here? Data answered him. It is caught between two conflicted masses of pressure. Sensors indicate that the freighter is powerless and there are no life signs aboard. Also, that they have been trapped in this area for an extended period of time. Estimate? How long? Considering the relative consistency of both pressure fronts and initial reads on hull integrity, I would estimate that this particular eddy has existed for 30 years or more. Picard's frown deepened. Can you get a visual? Trying, sir. A few seconds later, the main screen's view changed, and Vaughn caught his breath, fascinated. The long, dark freighter tumbled slowly end over end against its bright backdrop, as it apparently had for decades, dead and alone. Vaughn felt his earlier exhaustion dropping away at the sight, barely noticing his relief that there was no battle to be had. Haunted. It looks haunted. Captain, if you have no objection, I'd like to lead an away team to investigate, he said. Not sure why he was so intrigued, not caring particularly. It seemed to be a day for impulsiveness. Picard glanced at Vaughn and smiled, so slightly that it was barely visible. He looked back to the screen. Commander Data, is the ship's hull intact? Yes, sir. Meaning it's possible to initiate an atmosphere, at least temporarily. AG's a must, but we can suit it against cold. Wouldn't have to wait for an environmental toxin analysis either. Picard nodded and turned again to Vaughn. Commander, I hope you'll allow Commander Riker to accompany you and advise you in your selection of team members. Of course. Thank you, Captain. Vaughn and Riker both stood, Riker asking for Data to join them, recommending that LaForge and Ensign Dennings meet them at the transporter. Vaughn found himself unable to tear his gaze away from the examined freighter, and finally understood why he was so interested. The reason so fundamental, but so odd that he'd almost missed it. Somehow, looking at the lifeless freighter, he felt quite strongly that his future was inexorably tied to whatever they would find there. I am getting old. Such fanciful thinking and daydreaming adventure wasn't his style. Vaughn shook himself mentally and headed for the turbolift. But in spite of his own best efforts to act his age, his excitement only grew. And that is chapter 10. The first time I read this book, was a surprise. I was not expecting the Enterprise to show up. Did not expect Picard to play a role in this story. So, and I had mixed feelings. I like TNG. I like Picard. But I wasn't sure that it was necessary. I guess I was a little sensitive to the thinking that it really wasn't necessary for them to show up in a DS9 story, as if DS9 couldn't stand on its own. It's a little bit irrational. I think that feeling makes more sense like in the first season of the show, but not with these relaunch books after both shows are off the air, but that's how I remember feeling. Now though, and I like it. It's a surprise, but really what this chapter and the next one are doing is introducing Vaughn, who is going to be a major character. I don't think that needs to be spoiled. I'll talk a little bit more about Vaughn. I also had a misunderstanding of him, but I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But I remember how much I liked him. Well, not liked him like personally liked him, but I was intrigued by him. Not that I disliked him either, but I was intrigued by this new character. I was especially intrigued by the fact that they found a Cardassian freighter, but we'll talk about that in chapter 11 when we get chapter 11 too. But what really struck me this time reading was the visual descriptions of the Badlands. We're familiar with the Badlands and how they look if you watch the the show, but I thought the descriptions in this chapter really captured it. And I never thought about this consciously before, but I notice now how the storms, the perpetual storms in the Badlands, kind of mirror or echo or parallel, whichever term you like, the inner turmoil that Vaughn is feeling. I thought that's a nice touch. Other than that, I don't think there's a whole lot to say. There's not a lot of plot going on. There's just the Enterprise is looking for the Breen. They don't expect to find them. Really just establishes that the Enterprise is close by. It introduces Vaughn. It shows that he has a friendship, or at least a mutual understanding, with Picard. And I don't want to say I'd say it's a bit of a breather chapter, but not unnecessary. It's switching gears, but I think it does that very well, and it leaves you wondering how this is going to connect up with the main storyline. There are hints. Vaughn knows something. He's been getting secret reports, and so we're supposed to wonder about those. Could probably assume they have to do with the attack on the station, but don't know for sure. Kira is still waiting impatiently for Starfleet's response to that, so we'll see how the Enterprise connects there. And, well, that's about it. I liked it. And now, I think I'm just going to relax here in my deck chair, enjoying this lovely, if probably temporary, weather. So, see you next time for Chapter 11 of Avatar. Hope everyone's having a great time. Goodbye.